Going to go ahead and get started here about 5 minutes in. So thank you again, everyone, for joining and for joining us for this webinar on DHIS2 application development. We had our first webinar in this series last week, which was a high-level overview of the application platform and the tools that we're building for application development on the DHIS2 ecosystem. And today we're going to be diving a little bit more technically into how you might do some basic things in application development. It'll be kind of a very low, high-level overview. So it'll be a very quick kind of introduction to how you do some simple things. We won't get into too many of the advanced functionalities because there's a lot of it there. But we'll have some more opportunities coming up as well for increased additional learning around some of the more advanced use cases and tools that we have for DHIS2 application development. Thanks again, everyone, for joining, and looking forward to sharing this information with you. So if we go on to the next slide here, I want to start out by pointing out that we have a developers.dhis2.org webpage, which has a lot of information that we'll cover here and a lot more details and documentation and things like that. Additionally, on the developers.dhis2.org, there's a link to the community of practice specifically for application development, as well as to the events that, like this one that you're seeing today, and the ones that are coming up as well, and the registration for those. So be sure to check that out, check back frequently. We'll also be posting, we have been posting, we'll continue to post announcements and updates about our development tools. There'll be a blog post coming up shortly about the next release of our UI libraries, for instance. So really recommend that you follow along there. There's an RSS feed as well for that. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up just to show everybody what you can get to with respect to this webinar here today. We have just an introduction here with some links to the blog posts that I mentioned about with some different releases, documentation, some guides, and a link directly to the community of practice for application development. But today I'll focus just on this down here. So you have here a recording and the Q&A from last week's webinar, which was, again, a high-level overview of the DHIS2 application development ecosystem. And I also have a link here today to the community question and answer topic for today's webinar. So again, if you have questions as the presenters are going through their presentations, I recommend that you go to this community Q&A page that Alice has set up for us and post your questions here, and I will respond to them or bring them up with the other presenters who are on the webinar today, and we'll address those on the air, or if we don't get to them today, we'll follow up on responding directly in the community of practice. Again, developers.dhis2.org, you can click this community Q&A here. I'll talk a little bit more at the end about the workshop that's coming up at the end of June and the registration that has been open there. So there's also a link to that on developers.dhis2.org. So now to get back into our presentation, let's talk about what we have coming up here today. We have a few different presenters today, developers on the core team here at the University of Oslo who have been working on some of these tools for application development in DHIS2. We'll start with an introduction to just how to build a very basic DHIS2 application from scratch using our new tools, how simple and powerful those tools can be. That'll be led by Wahed. We'll then get into an introduction to the Application Hub, which has been revamped recently, and how you can use that to distribute your application and install it into DHIS2 instances. We'll then follow that with an introduction to the design system, which is the look and feel of DHIS2 as a platform, as well as the components and the look and feel kind of standardization of DHIS2 third-party applications. That'll be with Joe Cooper. And then Jan Gerke will follow that with an introduction to the specific component tools that we have developed that allow you to easily incorporate those design system rules and look and feel into your applications easily. And finally, I'll open it up for questions and answer some of the questions that have been brought up on the community of practice, and give a quick teaser about some of the more advanced functionality that is also available that we won't have time to get into in detail today, but that you can learn more about at developers.dhis2.org in the community as well as in future events. So again, if you have questions during all of these presentations, please feel free to post them at the community of practice. You can follow this app development category and look for Ready for Web App for the Web App Development Webinar Q&A, or follow the link on developers.dhis2.org. So just a quick recap before we get into Wahed's introduction here. A quick recap of some of the things we covered last week on the webinar, which is recorded, so you can go back and look at that as well. But basically, what is in a DHIS2 application? There's a lot of different things that are involved in making a DHIS2 application functional, robust, performant, and generic, so that it can be used across a lot of different different instances and different use cases. These are a few of them, but there are more certainly. But most of the things in this diagram here are common to all applications on DHIS2 and not specific to any one of them. So what we've done with the application platform concept is to split that out so that we have an application, which is just these specific components in the middle here, and a wrapper around that, which has all the other common pieces that an application developer no longer needs to worry about. And this allows us to really make it easier and easier to build core applications as well as third-party applications and slot them into the common app shell or app platform and make those applications as consistent and reusable as possible. There are a few things that allow us to do this, and these are the things that some of my colleagues are going to present today on this webinar. The first is unified build tooling, which allows us to build, test, and develop our core applications. Not core applications, but DHIS2 applications, both core and third-party apps. And the second is a common runtime, which allows us to have a standardized wrapper around the DHIS2 API and fetching the data from that API, as well as performing operations that are mutating the data in that system. And the third, which Joe and Jan Gerke will present, is our design system and our UI library to standardize the look and feel and make it as easy as possible to incorporate things like an org unit tree or the header bar into your applications as you're developing. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to a very quick introduction to, not very quick, but very high level introduction to what you can do with the DHIS2 application platform if you're starting from scratch, starting a brand new application. I will turn it over to Wahed for that. Wahed, are you available?
Yeah, I'm there. Thank you for the introduction, Austin.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, let's get right to it then.
I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so you can go.
Yeah. Okay, so you should see my screen now. Yep. Okay, we'll just start by creating a default app using the DHIS2 CLI. And we'll do that by installing the CLI tool on our machines. You can do that by adding a global binary into our path. What that will do once you do it is give us access to the D2 utility. And here we can create clusters and apps and various things. Right now, we're only going to use the app submenu, and we're going to initialize a new app using init and give it a name, something, right? This is the name. I've already done that. I've given my app a name, Program Lister App, just to save some time. And you can take a look at the files that are here by default. So as you can see, we have a source folder with an app.js and a test file. We have a README file, a package.json file, and a DHIS2 config file. Let's take a look at the first file here.
Well, I had one comment come in that just if you could increase the font size, so if it's able to.
Okay, yeah, sure.
That'd be great. Looks good. Thank you.
Okay. That should be good, I think. Okay, so the config file is quite basic. We specify the type of the app, the entry point. We can also specify, for example, a title that shows up on the header bar. We're not going to do that right now. Let's also take a look at the package JSON. We can see that some scripts have already been configured. We can start a server, we can test them, we can build a bundle. And as you can see, the dependencies are quite few. The default app.js contains some code. Let's take a look at how this looks like in our browser. Let's start up our server. Okay. Okay. So this normally looks like this. You have to log in to your DHIS2 instance. I'm running a local instance on my machine. So when you log in and write in your credentials there, and click the button, you get to this page. Normally this header bar up here works, but right now there is something wrong with my machine, I think, that makes that not work. Yeah. Okay. Let's take a look at how we can write a simple component, fetch some data from the DHIS2 instance, and then present it to the user. So let's just quickly remove some of the default data. Okay. As you can see, it has live reload, so you can see the changes as you save the code. Let's write a new component. We can call it a program list component. Let's import React and define our component. I'm going to give it a name, no arguments, and then I'm going to return something, right? And export it. Okay, so what I want to do is get all the programs in our DHIS2 instance and show them in a list. So we know from the DHIS2 API documentation that the program's endpoint and resource name is programs, and that gives us the ID and display name. Quite simple. So let's define a declarative query that gets us that information. And to do that, we're going to use the app runtimes query object to define our data needs. So the way you do that is something like that. And you can see the documentation up here as well in that URL. So all we need really is to define a query object, and we can give it a name. Let's see, we can give it programs, and inside here we have a query definition. So the resource we want is programs, and let's also give it some parameters so that we get the minimal amount of information from the server to reduce network load. So what we're going to do is say that we only want ID and display name as the fields, and we're going to turn paging off. Okay, that's all we need. How do we then use this query in our component? The way we do that is that we import something, a hook called useDataQuery from the DHIS2 App Runtime library. And what that query allows us to do is say, we then get back loading, an error, and the final data. And we just can use it by calling it with our query as a parameter. So we get all of these back from the hook, and then we can do some simple checks. If it's loading, we can just return a paragraph that says loading. If there's an error, we can return a paragraph that says error. And once we have gotten rid of those two cases, we know that our request has been successful and we have the data available. And now let's represent them to the user in a somewhat user-friendly way. And we're going to use DHIS2 UI core components for this. We're first going to add, add UI core, DHIS2 UI core to our dependencies. I have already done that to save some time, so I have them available. And the component we need from that library is menu and menu item. Okay. Yeah, this is probably going to change soon, this dependency right here. We're going to update information on our websites. So we can then return the menu items inside a menu. And we now have our programs, let's just define them here. Our programs are going to be inside the data object on line 16, this one. And that one has a field called programs that are going to contain the data that was fetched for that specific query definition. So programs, and we know that the programs are going to be inside another programs field. Okay, so here we have our programs. And then we can simply map all of them and map them to menu items. And for each program, we want a menu item. Let's just give it a key to get rid of an reactive warning. Let's just give it the key program.id and also give it a label of program.displayName. And we map that and return this. I think that should be it. We can take a look at it later. Let's import it into our main app file. Okay. And let's just render it inside this main container. Okay. I must have done, yeah. Let's take a look at our app then. Can't resolve. Yeah. Okay, it's loading, and as you can see, we have a list of the programs. That was quite simple, and that's all we're going to do on the development part. For this app, let's now just build a deploy ready bundle, which we can deploy to both the App Hub and to a DHIS2 instance. We're going to do that by just saying yarn build, which is going to run this script right here. And when we do that, that takes some time. We're going to get a new build folder. Inside that, a bundle folder that is going to contain a zip file of the program. And we can deploy this zip file in our local or another DHIS2 instance. I'm just going to show it on the local instance here. Let's go into our app management app. Let's upload our app. Yeah, let's check it out. Does it work? It sure does. So we have successfully deployed our app to the server, and we did not have to worry about fetching the data manually or worrying about the server API endpoint or something like that. Let's also quickly take a look at how we can deploy it in the App Hub, which Bert is going to talk about later anyway, but let's just quickly do that. Let's upload our app, give it a name, a description, the source code URL is optional, version, you also have to choose it, DHIS2 versions. Yeah, you probably should be careful with these, but right now our app is quite simple. And then finally just find our zip file and continue. And just give all of this information and then finally finish. And that is going to send you to the approval procedure in the App Hub. I think that was it. Did I miss something, Austin?
No, that was a great overview. Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I realize that for some people that may have been all review, and for some people that may have been a lot of information that was thrown at you. So just be aware that there's a lot of things going on under the hood here, and a lot of individual components, things like the app runtime, setting up an app platform component, building, things like the UI core, and we'll go over some of those in this webinar at a high level, but that's also something that you can look up in the documentation, you can ask about on the community if you have specific questions, and you can also learn more about at the events we have coming up, where we'll go into more detail and have more time to go over the different tools that we've built for application development. So thank you again, Wahed, for that great introduction, building a DHIS2 application from scratch. I think he got that done in about 10 minutes, which is probably a little bit faster than it was previously possible to build DHIS2 applications. So that's really what we're after here, is being able to build something that's powerful, that looks nice in a short amount of time, and with fewer dollars invested as well to build those applications. So with that, I will turn it over to Birk, who's going to talk a little bit more about the new application hub that Wahed introduced as well. Birk, are you there?
Yep.
Great.
Okay, so thank you, Austin, for the introduction, and thank you, Wahed. I saw that Wahed can you see my screen now? Wait, is it the correct app? Okay. So Wahed kind of went through the App Hub, which I'm going to introduce. Some of you might have seen it before. It's been recently renamed from App Store, which you may be familiar with. We figured App Hub is a more relevant name, so you don't really buy anything, since we're really pushing forwards for open source, as you know. Yeah, so if you go to apps.dhis2.org, you get this App Hub. You can see all the approved apps we have on the App Hub now. And hopefully towards 235, we're pushing for more continuous delivery, and you will see core apps here as well, not just third party. So now that you followed, after you followed the Wahed's introduction to creating an app, what do you do when your app is ready? You go to App Hub and you want to share your app with someone else, right? You don't want to sit on your app yourself. So you can log in with any Google accounts. I'll use my DHIS account. You get to this. You will probably not see this list. It's because I'm a manager and I get to approve and disapprove apps. So as Wahed showed, you have this upload thing. Can you hear me, or is the background noise really annoying? I'm sorry about that. Okay. Yeah. So he kind of showed you how you upload the app. You just follow this form. It's pretty simple. Version 01. Hopefully you can follow the semantic versioning. As also Vahad said, you should probably know kind of what DHIS version your app is supporting. You have the release channels here, which stable is just a stable version, and we will also enable canary versions if you have like a development version you want other people to test, or you can enable that in the app management down the line as well. So you can kind of upload apps and new versions and other one to test before you like release a stable version. So you can upload your zip file here. So I had showed just a build file from the build script. You have your development name, email, and also organization, which is going to be a bit changed really soon, like this week, where you have some organization management options. So where you can be a member of an organization and you can't really upload to the organization unless you're a member of it. So you have kind of more control if you're an organization that wants to have apps in your organization and don't want other people to just upload to your organization. Then you have, yep.
Dirk, we're seeing still the just the App Hub, the opening screen. Are you were typing?
Really?
Yeah.
I went through. Okay, thank you. That's really weird. Okay. What about now?
Yeah, this is showing the upload.
Yeah, okay. I don't know what happened. It froze. I had to alt tab. Okay, so just going through the form again. I'm sorry about that. You have the app name. Just follow the form here. It would be really nice to show the source code URL so other people can go and see your source code as another thing to embrace open source. You have this version form where you upload your app. You can also have a demo URL so other people can go to a live version of your app after you uploaded it. In the release channel, as I said, you can have like a development version and people can install that development version to their instance. Yeah. So developer, pretty simple. You can upload an image here. So DHIS logo, upload, do finish, uploads your app. So we'll find the app here. And then after it's uploaded, you'll kind of have to wait for some of the core developers or that has the authority to approve and disapprove apps, since we don't really want everyone to just upload and everyone can install any app, like you could have spammed or have some kind of malicious apps. So that's why we have kind of manual approve and disapproval and rejection process. But hopefully we can get into your app pretty fast. And then after it's uploaded here, after it's approved, I won't really approve this since this is the live app hub. You can create your images here. You can upload new versions here. You can change your versions. You can edit your application information here. Upload more images. You can change the logo here. You can change the caption. DHIS2 logo. Then you get the caption. So after it's uploaded, it's approved, it will get to the front page here, which everyone can see without being logged in. And then you can go to the app management app in your instance. It will show up here. If it meets the version of like the minimal and maximum approval version, it will show up here and you can install it directly from your instance, like here. So now it's installed to the instance, you can go to the app. And then that's how you deploy your app and easy for everyone with an instance and internet connection to install your app. Okay, I think that's it.
Great, thanks, Birk. That was again a quick overview of the App Hub and how you can deploy your applications for other people to install, as well as how you can install an application from the App Hub in your own instances. So thank you again for that overview. Since we're just moving right along with this kind of seminar overview, I'll turn it over to Joe to talk about the DHIS2 Design System. A reminder, we've got some questions coming in already, but if you have any questions that you want us to address in this webinar or that come up as you're watching the presentations, feel free to go over to the community practice in the app development category. And there's a topic in there called Q&A discussion for ready for web app development webinar. Feel free to go over there and ask your questions directly. With that, I'll turn it over to Joe. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Austin. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the DHIS2 Design System. The design system, as Austin mentioned in the introduction, is concerned with how applications look and how they work visually. So how the user interface is built, how users interact with the app, and so on. The idea of having a design system is to create a consistent user experience. So when all DHIS2 applications use similar components, it means that things that a user learns in one application, they can transfer that knowledge to another application. So if org unit selection is always done using the DHIS2 org unit tree, then a user gets to know that, they feel comfortable, apps are trustworthy, and so on. So as a third-party developer, there's a lot to be gained by using the design system and components we have. I'll just walk through how the design system can be consumed. It's a repo on the DHIS2 GitHub. It's just a collection of markdown files to read or print as you wish. The first section of the design system is concerned with the principles of design. So that's setting guidelines for how DHIS2 applications should communicate, spacing, how applications should use color and typography and icons and so on. I'll just show a few examples. In content and communication, there's guidelines about how to communicate effectively with users and the style of communication. So there's some examples here of what to do and what not to do. In what not to do here, we're using passive language, unclear and technical language. And then on the left, we have a guideline of how to communicate more effectively. We have guidelines for writing content for buttons and actions, how to communicate errors effectively to users, how to keep the user informed, and so on. We also have those same kind of guidelines for how elements and components should be spaced in an application, how they should be stacked. All of this is with the idea of making applications that are easy to use. Here are some principles around the use of color in DHIS2. So we have guidelines for that. The second part of the system are the components. And these are ready-to-use components that are built with the principles in mind. So let's look at the notice box, for example. So a DHIS2 design system notice box looks like this. At the top of a component document, there's some guidelines on the usage. So here we'll explain when to use a notice box, when not to use a notice box, and so on. We go through the composition where that is relevant, and we'll go through the types and options, and also show some examples too. So each one of these component documents gives an overview of when to use the component, how it should be used, when it shouldn't be used, and so on. You can see here the alert bar is a floating alert that informs the user about temporary information. So then I go on to describe the different types of alert bars and when those should be used. Here's a good example of when consistency can really be beneficial to DHIS2 users. If all DHIS2 apps are using critical notice alert bars in the correct way, then a user will always understand that a critical alert bar means the following things. Similarly with success. If one application used a success bar to communicate something critical, the user would be very confused because that would be completely inconsistent with the rest of the platform. At the top of each document, there's also a link to the design spec where that's relevant. If you want to check out how this was specified and how it was built and any notes, perhaps if you're building it for another language. And also a link directly to the UI library where it's built with the live examples. Jan Gerke will follow me today and talk more about this system, so I won't go into it too much. So to summarize, if you are building DHIS2 applications, you can really get a head start by using the design system and its components. The first thing you should do, and all DHIS2 developers should do, is get familiar with the principles that we listed in the first half. And then when you have researched your app use cases and you're starting to build out the screens and interfaces, try to use the components where they work for you and where they work for the use cases. And you can find out much more information about each one. If there's anything that's missing, or if there's feedback on any components, you can use GitHub in the usual way. You can open issues if there's something that's lacking or suggestions for other components, then all feedback's very welcome. Okay, that about wraps up the design system. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Joe. There's a lot of great content and information there for anybody that wants to look into how to communicate in DHIS2 applications or just web applications in general, and how to follow the design guidelines so that you're providing a good experience to your user. So I think there's a lot of really great information there. Thanks for sharing that. With that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jan Gerke, who will demonstrate some of the components that we provide in our platform to implement those design guidelines within your applications. Jan Gerke, I can't hear you. I don't know if you're talking.
Yeah, sorry, for some reason my window just disappeared and I couldn't unmute myself. I just tried again. Okay, so you should be able to see my screen now, right? Hello?
I can. It's all gray.
But you can hear me now, right?
Yes, I can.
And do you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Okay. Okay, so hello everyone. I'm going to give you an overview over our UI libraries and how we're going to use the design system that Joe just presented as the developers at DHIS2. Our UI libraries are a representation of the design system that you just saw. And by using these libraries, you're going to have a consistent look and feel across all the apps. Also, the third-party apps will have the same look and feel as the core applications. Our UI libraries currently are only for React.js because that's one of our primary technologies that we currently use for app development. There is a UI library which is called @DHIS2/UI, and this one is the complete library. It exports all contents of all individual libraries. It's more convenient to use because you don't have to worry about what the individual libraries are. It's a bit more stable because you don't have to worry if we're going to restructure the individual libraries. Sometimes there's a chance that we might split widgets into several individual libraries. There's a chance that a component might move from one library to another. So by just using the complete library, a UI, it's going to be a bit easier for you to just work with that. And then the individual libraries are mainly used or are mainly individual because it's easier for us to organize our components. You can easily install a UI library with simply installing the dependency either with npm or yarn. And we have online demos for all of our components. They're just accessible online. And we're trying to we're trying to showcase every component that we have and in all its variants. So you should be able to more or less see everything that you can do with the components. And this is also a very good go-to place when you're working on an app and you just want to see how components work or what other variants there are. So you can just go there and you have a very good overview. You can also find the code of this, the source code of the stories in the same folder as the components. So it's also very easy to find all these things. So I'm going to show you the storybook now. I'm just going to go to the repository of UI in this case. And you can see there's a live demo link in here. And when you go there, it will open up the storybook that we use to show all of our components. It's going to take a second. Okay, there we go. So here in the sidebar, you can see the components with this blue icon and all the variants that exist of this component. And you can see we have some structure in place here. This one is basically all our components that you can just use to ensure that you have the same look and feel across apps. We have some utility components and we have form components, which I'm going to explain in a bit. So for example, Joe mentioned the notice box. And then here you can see we have different variants of the notice box. And here you see how it's going to look when it's rendered. You can see there's a default, warning, error with a long title. I can also reduce the width of the actual area, so you can see this works quite well. Normally, you should be able to see the code that you need to write this particular component in the add-ons. For some reason, it's not showing. We're going to address this very soon. But while it's still broken, you can just go to the repository, go to the component that you're trying to understand. And so, for example, if you want to know how the alert bar works, or you saw an example where you want to know what the code looks like, you can go to the alert bar stories.js. And here you can find all the stories that you can see in the storybook. And you can see what props have to be used, how you have to set up this component. There are also more complex components in here. So for example, there is the transfer component. This one is actually stateful. So you should be able to, for example, here I should be able to select an item. In this case, you see this is a single selection mode. I can also select multiple items at the same time. And yeah, they're just more examples where you can just see how this component works and what it can do. In this form section, you will see that all the components that are inside this form section are also inside the widget section. So these are basically the same components, but they are made, they are changed in a way so that they work out of the box with React Final Form, which is a third-party library that we're using to build forms. And in here, you only have demos of how these individual components work. So I have prepared a little example with our app platform CLI utility that you just saw some presentations ago. And I've created a very simple form in here. And you can see that I'm importing everything from the UI library. And then I'm going to use form and field from the React Final Form library, which is provided by this library as well. And then I'm just going to use these third-party components. So I can just use React Final Form in its full capacity and just supply our components to these React Final Form components. And it just works right out of the box. So for example, surname, I have to provide a surname. If I just type my surname in here, it just works. If I delete this one, now it will tell me that I have to provide a value because we're just leveraging on the React Final Form validation mechanism. So this just works right out of the box. And I also can't just submit because then it will tell me that I have to provide values. So I'm going to insert some values here. And now you see all the errors are gone and I can submit. And now you can see that all these values in here are just passed to a custom onSubmit function, which in this case just alerts the values of the form. So if you find bugs or you have feature requests or you want to contribute to the code, you can just go to the GitHub repository that you just saw, github.com/DHIS2/UI, where you can use the issues to either file bug reports, propose new features, or ask general questions if you have questions. But if you want to contribute, you can also just fork the repository, do the change, and propose a pull request. And we would be very grateful if you do that. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Yanger. And again, that was another presentation that was a very high-level overview of a very powerful and extensive library. So there are a lot of things that weren't covered there, but we'll go into more detail about those things in the workshop that's coming up, as well as you can find more in our documentation directly or ask us on the community. So with that, I'm going to give a quick kind of just introduction to some of the more advanced topics that we didn't cover directly here today, just a couple of them, and then I'll open it up for anybody that has any more questions. So if you have questions, please go to the post or the topic on the community of practice. Again, it's linked from developers.dhis2.org, and post your questions there so that we can address them in the last couple minutes of this webinar. And I will go ahead and share my screen again to get this back up and running. Let's see if we get this. Okay. So if we go down to at the end here. So as Björk mentioned, we have the DHIS2 App Hub where applications can be published and then installed into individual DHIS2 instances. So that's the right-hand side of this application lifecycle. So that's after you've built your application with the application platform, as Wahed mentioned, using the tools that Joe and Jan Gerke introduced. But what do you do? How do you actually test that application locally? And I know that there was a question on the community of practice that I answered there in text form, but I'll answer that here as well. When Wahed introduced or built his first application, you saw a dialog that popped up that allowed you to put in a server, a username, and a password to log into a DHIS2 instance. That is something that is enabled in development, so it makes the job of the developer much easier in that they can test their application against multiple different DHIS2 servers, or a DHIS2 server that's hosted maybe at a fully qualified domain name, a top level domain, rather than on their local machine. we don't make any assumptions about that. So they can go ahead and introduce or test their application against those instances. However, when you actually build it for production, as Wahed also introduced or demonstrated, and then install it into a DHIS2 instance, you don't see that dialog anymore because the authentication is already taken care of for you. The server discovery of figuring out where the server is actually living is already done for you. So there's no dialog for login when it's installed into a DHIS2 instance. Just wanted to answer that question quickly here as well on the webinar. As you're developing your applications, we've also built a separate portion of this CLI tool, which we call D2 cluster. And I'll demonstrate that in a minute. But basically what that allows you to do is to spin up local instances of DHIS2 very easily so that you can test against different versions of DHIS2, different database setups, different metadata systems within your local machine without needing to spin up a new server in the cloud or to install a Tomcat instance or multiple Tomcat instances on your local machine. And to do that, we've basically wrapped a functionality around Docker, which you can use on a local machine. So this is a quick overview of what that would look like, how you would set up your local CLI and spin up a local instance. You can also pass it the seed command, and it will automatically download a demo database that is the same demo database that's used by play.dhis2.org. And that will automatically seed that database into your local machine so you can test against some real data that exists there. There are also options to specify custom databases or database dumps to be able to instantiate those instances. This is really cool because it allows you to have potentially multiple instances running on your local machine to test against 232, 233, 234, et cetera, or different database versions. You can find out more about this, as with everything else, on the developers.dhis2.org. If you go to the docs section and you click on the D2 command line tool, so the command line interface for DHIS2 development, there's a pretty extensive documentation here specifically around the D2 cluster command, which talks about the different versions of DHIS2 that are available on Docker Hub. They're built by the DHIS2 continuous integration system and automatically deployed to Docker Hub. So you can download those versions. You can also build custom images yourself. There's some examples here of specifically how to spin up individual versions or individual stable versions of DHIS2, as well as development versions if you want to work on a branch that is not an official release of DHIS2 core. You can also use custom DHIS2 instances or images if you're building your own local version of DHIS2. And there's a lot of other customization that you can refer to in this documentation as well. So that's one kind of advanced use case, and that really makes it powerful and easy to test your applications in a local development environment. The other thing that I wanted to point out, and you'll see that this is the documentation that that is linked from the docs page of developers.dhis2.org, is mostly interlinked. So if we go now to this app runtime, we can see that this has the documentation for the query component or the query hook that Wahed demonstrated, as well as other things that are part of the common runtime for DHIS2 in the application platform. There was a question as well on the community practice about the use config hook. This is uses React hooks, which you can learn a lot more about at reactjs.org. Have very good documentation about learning React, learning specifically hooks, which are very powerful and useful in this context. But this is the use config hook. And basically this allows any component in your application to have access to the base URL and the API version of your of the server that you're talking to. So when you type in a custom URL into that server box, when you're logging into your DHIS2 instance, your application in development mode, it will automatically propagate that information to any component that uses this hook and give you access to that base URL. So you don't need to do any custom building with localhost 8080 or those types of things that were previously required to make that happen. This is just another function of the app runtime. So you have the use config hook. You also have the use data query hook, which Wahid demonstrated to fetch the list of programs. There are a lot of different, not too many, but a few different options here that you can customize the behavior of this hook. There's also a component version of this. So if you aren't comfortable using hooks, or you want to embed this within another component, you can pass you can use a component rather than a hook and get the same data as the hook returns. Finally, there's what we call mutations, which allow you to do post requests or post or put requests to the DHIS2 API to change things in the data model. So if you want to add a new program from your application, or you want to upload some data for a particular event or something along those lines, you can use a mutation rather than a query. Again, this is something that's more advanced that we'll get into in the workshop at the end of June. I'll talk a little bit more about in just a moment. And then finally, you have an imperative way to make these queries and mutation calls using the engine object that you can get with the use data engine hook. We recommend that you use the declarative mechanism for fetching this data rather than the imperative mechanism. I talked a little bit about the difference between those two in the webinar last week, and we'll be adding more information about that to our documentation as well. But this was just a kind of quick taster of some of the more advanced functions that you can do that we didn't cover today. And we will be covering these in more detail in the upcoming events. I'm gonna go ahead and check if there's any additional questions here. The minimum DHIS2 server support for the components and app runtime utilities to work. This is a good question. So the components are agnostic of the version of the server for the most part. So the core components have no connection with the DHIS2 API whatsoever. So things like buttons, alert bars, notification boxes, those all can be used even outside of DHIS2 completely. They're standalone UI components that don't have any interaction directly with DHIS2 API. So there's no requirement for what DHIS2 server those support. Some of the widgets that Jan Gerke demonstrated, things like the transfer component, actually not, but the things like the organization unit tree or the header bar have some requirements on the API that they talk to. I believe we typically recommend 232 or above for platform applications. You could make it work for servers that are below 232. We've seen it down to 230 and potentially below as well. But we only recommend for 232 and above at this point. If there's requests for expanding the coverage of the platform or the runtime, definitely open to hearing those. Getting back here to this, the upcoming community and resources that we have. I know we're running out of time here. Feel free to post any questions that you have on that community post topic, and we'll respond to them going forward as well. And just to get into some of the upcoming workshops and topics or events that we have coming up. At the end of June, so in about 2 weeks, June 24th and 25th, we have the first workshop of our Academy series. This is going to be a 2-day workshop diving in a little bit more detail into the different topics that we talked about today. It will still be fairly basic, but it will give you a solid foundation for building DHIS2 applications. We'll then follow that with an independent project that will, for our Academy track participants, will be required, but that will have a long time to be able to accomplish that, and that'll be over the course of July and half of August. And then we'll have a second workshop for the Academy in August, which will require participation in the June Academy, and that people that have done then at the end the workshop 1, the project, and workshop 2 will get a certification through our Academy system that they've participated in this Academy and are have the skills to build sophisticated DHIS2 applications. So look for developers.dhis2.org for more information about these events as they come up. We're probably not going to be publishing or publicizing the end of June event too much because we're already have quite a bit of interest and we can't take everyone. So it'll be on a first come first serve basis if you want to register for that event. If there's a lot of interest and a lot of people that aren't able to make it in the June dates, we may have another workshop as well. But even if you aren't able to make it to one of those events coming up or the Academy itself, we will be translating a lot of this material into online learning documentation and workshops as well. So the sessions from the workshops will be turned into online videos that people can follow at their own pace to learn about these same topics. We'll also be working with the University of Oslo to develop some university level courses, as well as putting together a self-paced academy. So similar to the hands-on academy that we're running online this June, July, and August, we'll be putting together a self-paced version of that anyone can do at their own time. That'll probably be available in September or October timeframe. Feel free to give any feedback that you have about this, any questions, concerns, thoughts to me directly, or post them on the community of practice, and we will take those into consideration as we move forward. Again, you can find all this information at developers.dhis2.org. There's announcements about, for instance, the next version of the UI library that Jan Gerke demonstrated is out now, and we'll be posting an announcement about that shortly on developers.dhis2.org. You can also find information about upcoming events, documentation, some guides about getting started in developing for DHIS2, and we're looking to expand this documentation and these resources significantly. So any feedback or anything that you find missing that you would like us to add or would like to contribute yourself, we are very open to that, those contributions and that feedback. And with that, I will open it up once more for questions. And if anybody, I know we're just over time now. If anybody has any questions, feel free to post them right now to the community of practice. It looks like we have, yeah, it looks like we don't have any new questions here. I'll also be posting a poll here on the community of practice. I'm going to post that right now, which just ask for your feedback. If you want to post any feedback about this webinar, the webinar last week, and answer this poll to share with us what you think, what you would like to see more of in terms of learning material. We'd very much appreciate your feedback there. Just to wrap up here at the end of the webinar, we're going to do a little bit of a funny thing. It's totally optional if you'd like to, but if everyone could turn on your video very quickly, stop the share. We're going to just try to get an overview of everyone that was on this call. We've about 6 people joining. Turn on your video and wave. And thank you all very much for joining us again.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.